There is something you have been doing wrong your entire life, and it has nothing to do with what you say, how you look, or how hard you try. It is something far more fundamental, far more quietly devastating, and far more invisible to everyone around you, including yourself. You have been operating under the assumption that the way to become magnetic, to become the kind of person others cannot stop thinking about, is to give more of yourself. More warmth, more effort, more availability, more performance. And because no one ever told you otherwise, you kept giving, kept showing up, kept making yourself easier to access. And you watched, confused and quietly diminishing, as the people you invested in turned their attention elsewhere. You told yourself it was timing. You told yourself it was chemistry. You told yourself it was luck. It was none of those things. What was actually happening was a slow, systematic erosion of your psychological position, and you were the one holding the chisel. The first thing you need to understand, genuinely understand, not just intellectually acknowledge, is that obsession is never created by familiarity. Obsession is created by incompleteness. The human mind does not fixate on what it fully possesses. It fixates on what it cannot entirely resolve. This is not a metaphor. This is the architecture of how attention actually functions in the brain. When something is fully known, fully available, fully understood, the mind files it away and moves forward. That is not cruelty. That is neurological efficiency. The mind allocates its processing resources toward unresolved patterns, toward open loops, toward questions that do not yet have answers. And if you have been making yourself completely known, telegraphing your emotions, explaining your every move, ensuring everyone always knows exactly where they stand with you, you have been, with tremendous sincerity and terrible strategy, making yourself psychologically dismissible. This is the disruption you need to sit with before anything else, because most of what follows will be useless to you if you skip past this moment and move too quickly toward tactics. Tactics applied to an unexamined identity are just performance, and performance, no matter how refined, is always eventually seen through. What you are building here is something different. What you are building is a shift in how you occupy space. Not just physical space, but cognitive space, emotional space, the interior landscape of everyone who comes into contact with you. That kind of presence cannot be faked, and it cannot be rushed, but it can be constructed deliberately from the inside out. The question is whether you are willing to look at what has actually been happening before you decide what to do next. Here is what has actually been happening. Every time you moved quickly to reassure someone, you were signaling anxiety. Every time you over-explained your decisions, you were broadcasting a need for approval. Every time you matched someone else's emotional temperature in order to feel connected, you were surrendering the one thing that makes you worth thinking about, your own distinct psychological gravity. You were dissolving yourself into the relational field, and then wondering why people couldn't quite locate you in it. This is not a character flaw. This is a learned behavior, and it was probably learned very early, in environments where emotional visibility felt like the price of belonging. You learned that being known was the same as being loved. You learned that being warm was the same as being safe. You learned that transparency was a virtue and mystery was a form of deception. And now, years later, you are operating with a social architecture that was designed for survival in a context that no longer exists, and you are applying it to relationships, to professional environments, to every room you walk into, and wondering why the returns keep diminishing. What no one tells you is that the people who command the most sustained psychological attention from others are not the most open. They are not the most expressive. They are not the most relationally generous. They are the most internally coherent. There is a difference, a vast consequential difference, between someone who is emotionally available and someone who is emotionally grounded. Availability says, I will give you whatever you need to feel comfortable. Groundedness says, I know who I am, and that knowledge does not shift based on how you respond to me. Availability creates comfort, groundedness creates fascination, and fascination is the engine of obsession. Not infatuation, obsession, the kind of sustained, involuntary mental return that happens when someone cannot stop processing you because you have given them just enough to engage with and not enough to fully resolve. You have been optimizing for comfort when you should have been cultivating fascination. And the reason this matters, the reason this is worth sitting with uncomfortably for a moment, is that comfort is forgettable. Not because the person giving it is unworthy, but because the mind does not need to keep returning to what has already been made fully safe. The mind moves on from what it has domesticated, and if you have made yourself psychologically domestic, predictable in your warmth, reliable in your validation, consistent in your accommodation, you have removed yourself from the category of things the mind compulsively returns to. You are present in people's lives. You are simply not present in their thoughts when you are absent. And that gap between physical presence and psychological residence is precisely where influence lives or dies. There is something else operating here that most people never examine, because examining it requires a level of honesty about power that most social narratives actively discourage. Every interaction you have ever had has contained a power dynamic, not a hostile one, not necessarily, but a structural one. In every conversation, every relationship, every room, someone is setting the emotional frame and someone is responding to it. Someone is establishing the psychological tone and someone is calibrating themselves to it. This is not manipulation. This is just how social dynamics function. The question is not whether this is happening, it always is, but whether you are aware of it and whether you are in any position to work with it consciously rather than simply being shaped by it without knowing it. Most people are unconsciously reactive. They enter interactions with their emotional state already visible, already broadcast, already offering itself up as raw material for the other person to work with. And then they wonder why they so often leave conversations feeling slightly less than they intended. What you are beginning to understand, what this entire framework is designed to help you understand in precise, applicable terms, is that psychological obsession is not created by intensity. It is not created by beauty or status or charisma, as most people define it. It is created by a very specific combination of presence and restraint, of warmth and containment, of engagement and strategic incompleteness. And before you can access any of that, you have to be willing to see clearly what you have been doing instead. You have been giving too much, too soon, too consistently. You have been resolving tension before it could do its work. You have been answering questions that were never actually asked, filling silences that were actually doing something useful, explaining yourself to people who had not yet decided whether they were paying attention. You have been spending psychological currency you did not need to spend, in rooms where the economics were never in your favor, and wondering why your balance keeps coming up short. The disruption is this: everything you have been told about connection, that it requires openness, availability, and consistent emotional labor, is only partially true. Connection requires resonance. Resonance requires friction. And friction requires two distinct surfaces. If you have been making yourself entirely smooth, entirely accommodating, entirely frictionless, you have removed the very conditions under which real fascination can emerge. What comes next is not about becoming cold. It is not about becoming strategic in a way that feels foreign or uncomfortable or false. It is about becoming coherent, about developing an interior that does not shift with every relational wind, about understanding at a level that changes how you move through the world, that the most powerful psychological position is not the one that offers the most. It is the one that simply cannot be fully contained. Now that you understand what you have been doing, you need to understand why it works the way it does, why availability erodes influence, why emotional transparency reduces psychological weight, why the people who demand the least attention seem to command the most of it. This is not about surface observation. Surface observation gives you rules without understanding, and rules without understanding collapse the moment conditions change. What you need is the underlying mechanism, the actual psychological engine that determines who occupies mental real estate and who gets filed away. Once you see it clearly, you will recognize it everywhere, in every relationship you have ever had, in every person who ever held your attention longer than they logically should have, in every room you walked into where someone said almost nothing and still somehow owned the space. The mechanism is called cognitive load distribution, and it operates beneath conscious awareness in every social interaction you have ever participated in. Here is how it works. The brain is constantly making resource allocation decisions: how much attention to deploy, how much processing to sustain, how much of its limited predictive modeling bandwidth to dedicate to any given stimulus. When something is fully predictable, the brain reduces its investment in tracking it, not out of indifference, out of efficiency. The brain is a prediction machine. Its primary function is to model the world well enough to navigate it with minimal error. When it has fully modeled something, when it can predict with high confidence what that person will do, how they will react, what they will need, it downgrades the processing priority of that thing. It has been solved. It can be managed on autopilot. This is why familiarity breeds not contempt, exactly, but something worse: cognitive economy. You stop being something the brain actively works to understand. You become background. The people who generate sustained psychological pull have, whether consciously or not, made themselves resistant to full modeling. Not by being chaotic or inconsistent in ways that are exhausting, but by maintaining what might be called a coherent unpredictability. They are deeply themselves, but that self contains layers that do not all become visible at once. They reveal in increments. They withhold not out of game playing, but out of genuine self-containment. They have an interior life that does not require external validation to sustain itself. And this internal sufficiency creates a kind of gravitational density that other people can feel without being able to name. The brain registers them as an unsolved problem, not a threatening one, but a compelling one, and keeps returning to them the way a tongue returns to a missing tooth, not because it wants to, because it cannot help it. This is the mechanism that most social advice completely ignores. Most social advice operates on the level of behavior modification. Say this, don't say that, use this body language, avoid this tone, and behavior modification can produce short-term results. But behavior modification without an understanding of the underlying mechanism is just performance, and performance has a shelf life. The person watching you perform, even if they cannot consciously identify that it is performance, will eventually feel the seams. The inauthenticity registers subconsciously as noise in the signal, and noise degrades trust. What you are building instead is not a performance. It is a structural position, a way of being that naturally produces the psychological conditions under which obsession grows, not because you are engineering it artificially, but because you have aligned your external behavior with a genuine internal architecture. The second component of the mechanism involves emotional contagion and its relationship to leverage. Most people understand, at some level, that emotions are contagious, that you tend to pick up the emotional tone of the people around you. What most people do not understand is that this contagion flows directionally, and that direction is determined by emotional stability. The person in any interaction who is more emotionally regulated, more internally steady, less visibly reactive, will always have their emotional state transmitted to the other person more powerfully than the reverse. This is not a small thing. This is the entire ballgame of interpersonal influence. If you walk into a conversation already emotionally activated, anxious, needy, overeager, overinvested, you are broadcasting that activation, and the other person's nervous system picks it up and responds to it. Not always consciously, but the calibration happens, and the calibration shifts the entire relational dynamic in a way that disadvantages you before you have said a single word. The person who enters the same room in a state of genuine calm, not performed calm, not forced calm, but the real steadiness that comes from not needing the interaction to go a particular way, that person is not just more pleasant to be around. They are, neurologically speaking, more powerful, because their emotional state is the one that sets the frame. Their nervous system is the one that the other person's nervous system begins to entrain to. This is co-regulation, and it is one of the most underappreciated dynamics in all of human social behavior. You cannot think your way into this position. You cannot perform your way into it. You have to actually arrive at a place where your internal state is genuinely independent of the outcome of the interaction. And that independence, paradoxically, is what makes the outcome of the interaction more likely to go in your favor. Here is the third component, and this one requires particular attention because it runs directly counter to most of what you have been told about relationships. Validation is currency, not metaphorically, functionally. When you give validation freely, consistently, automatically, you devalue it. You devalue it for the recipient, and you devalue yourself in the process. Not because you are being diminished, but because the economics of scarcity and abundance are psychological laws, not just market principles. Something that is always available costs nothing in terms of cognitive or emotional investment. Something that is occasionally available, or conditionally available, or earned rather than given freely, that thing becomes disproportionately valuable, not because it is intrinsically better, but because the brain assigns value partially based on what had to be expended to acquire it. This is called effort justification, and it operates automatically, without the person even realizing it is happening. The implications of this are significant and uncomfortable. If you have been generous with your approval, if you have been quick to compliment, quick to agree, quick to affirm, quick to make others feel good about themselves in your presence, you have been conditioning the people in your life to expect that from you without earning it. And things we receive without earning do not generate obsession. They generate comfort at best, dependency at worst, and eventually, when they are withdrawn, even briefly, even accidentally, they generate resentment. Not because you withdrew something valuable, but because the person had structured their expectation around its automatic availability, and any deviation from that structure feels like a rupture. You become associated not with the positive feeling you were trying to create, but with the anxiety of potential loss. That is not a psychological position of influence. That is an emotional liability. What generates obsession is a different kind of engagement entirely. It is engagement that feels earned, that feels like it means something when it arrives. That carries weight precisely because it is not automatic. When someone senses that your attention is genuine, not performed, not habitual, but actually directed, they experience it differently than they experience the attention of someone who is generous with everyone. Your presence becomes an event rather than a constant. Your approval becomes signal rather than noise. And signal, genuine, non-diluted signal, is the rarest and most sought-after thing in a world drowning in performed connection and automatic affirmation. The brain will return again and again to the source of genuine signal, not because it is chasing validation, but because real resonance in a world of performance registers as something profoundly, irresistibly worth understanding. The mechanism, fully assembled, looks like this. Cognitive incompleteness drives sustained attention. Emotional groundedness determines who sets the relational frame. Scarcity of validation creates disproportionate value. Internal coherence generates psychological gravity. And all of these operate beneath the level of conscious decision-making in the people you interact with. They do not choose to find you fascinating. They cannot choose not to, because you have structured your presence in a way that makes their own cognitive and emotional architecture do the work for you. That is not manipulation, that is mastery. And the difference between the two is not what you do. It is what is true about you while you do it. You now understand the architecture of psychological pull. You understand why the mechanism works. But understanding is not yet application. Between insight and embodiment is a gap that most people underestimate. Because insight feels like change, and change, by definition, requires something more uncomfortable than understanding. What you are about to receive is not a list of techniques. It is a set of precise behavioral adjustments, each targeting a specific dimension of how you currently show up. Adjustments that, when implemented with consistency and internal alignment, begin to restructure the psychological experience people have when they interact with you. These are not tricks. Tricks decay. These are calibrations. And calibrations, maintained long enough, become character. The first and most immediate adjustment involves tempo, specifically the tempo of your response. In conversation, in text, in every medium through which you communicate and react. The person who responds fastest is almost never the person with the most psychological leverage. Fast response signals high availability, and high availability, as the mechanism in Part 2 made clear, reduces perceived value and increases the responder's sense of emotional dependence on the interaction. You have likely been responding quickly not because it serves you, but because the discomfort of not responding quickly feels worse than the cost of always responding fast. That discomfort is a signal worth examining. It is telling you something about where your sense of security in a relationship is actually located. And if it is located in the other person's immediate approval of you, then you are operating from a position of structural weakness, regardless of how confident you may appear in other areas. Slowing your response tempo is not about playing games. It is about developing the genuine internal experience of not needing to resolve every relational tension immediately. When a message sits unanswered, not ignored but held, something happens on the other end of that conversation. The sender becomes conscious of the gap, and in that gap, their mind begins to work. It begins to process. It begins to assign weight to what they said, to wonder how it landed, to anticipate your response in a way that would not have happened if you had answered in 30 seconds. You did nothing. You simply allowed the natural cognitive weight of delayed resolution to do what it does automatically. The gap created the engagement, not you. You just had the presence of mind not to fill it. This extends to physical conversation as well. The person who rushes to fill every silence, who offers the next sentence before the previous one has fully settled, who accelerates when they feel uncertainty in the room, is doing the emotional equivalent of chasing. Silence in conversation is not empty. Silence is pressure, and pressure in any system reveals character. When you become comfortable with conversational silence, when you can let a beat extend past the point where most people would jump in, something shifts in the room. The other person becomes aware of the silence too, and now instead of you managing the discomfort of it, they are. Instead of you filling the space, they fill it. And what people say when they are slightly uncomfortable and filling space is far more revealing and far more invested than anything they would have said in the smooth, managed flow of a conversation where you never let the pressure build. The second adjustment is in the domain of framing, which is perhaps the most powerful and least understood lever in all of social influence. Framing is not spin. Framing is the selection of which reality you choose to engage with, and from what position you choose to engage with it. Every interaction contains multiple possible frames, multiple ways of organizing the meaning of what is happening, and the person who establishes the frame that the interaction proceeds within has already won something significant before any specific exchange has taken place. Most people surrender the frame before they even realize there was one to hold. They enter conversations already oriented toward the other person's emotional state, already calibrated to the other person's concerns, already trying to figure out how to fit themselves into the space the other person has implicitly defined. This is not generosity. It is a structural concession, and you have been making it automatically in virtually every interaction because no one ever told you that you were allowed to establish the terms. Framing, practiced concretely, looks like this. You do not adopt the emotional register of the conversation as it is presented to you. You bring your own. Not aggressively, not in a way that dismisses what the other person is feeling, but with a steadiness that quietly relocates the emotional center of gravity. When someone approaches you in a state of urgency, your calm does not match their urgency. It receives it, it acknowledges it, shows it has been heard, but it does not become it. When someone attempts to position you as subordinate within a dynamic, your response does not argue the positioning. It simply operates from a different one, not reactively, not defensively, just from somewhere else, from a place that had its own coordinates before the conversation began and will have them after. This is what is meant by composure as a power shift. Composure is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of a self that is larger than any single emotional event. When you can remain composed, genuinely composed, not performing composure, in moments where most people become visibly reactive, you do something extraordinary. You make the other person aware of their own reaction in a way that would not have happened if you had matched it. Your steadiness becomes a mirror, and in that mirror they see themselves, perhaps more clearly than they intended to. This is not uncomfortable for them because you did anything aggressive. It is uncomfortable because your presence made the space clear enough to see in. That kind of clarity is rare, and rare things, as you now understand, generate disproportionate cognitive investment. The third adjustment involves what you choose to reveal and the sequencing in which you reveal it. Most people front-load their self-disclosure. They tell you who they are early, comprehensively, with a kind of biographical openness that is meant to signal authenticity, but functions in practice as premature intimacy. Premature intimacy short-circuits the natural development of fascination by eliminating the investigative pull, the desire to know more, before it has had time to build into something that actually motivates sustained engagement. If someone knows your entire story in the first 3 conversations, there is no story left to seek. The curiosity that would have continued to draw them back has already been satisfied. You have resolved your own mystery before it could do any work. Revelatory sequencing, the deliberate management of what you share, when and at what depth, is not deception. It is simply the recognition that real intimacy is earned through investment over time, and that investment requires something to pursue. You reveal enough to create resonance. You withhold enough to sustain curiosity. The withholding is not a gap in the relationship. It is its architecture. The parts of you that are not yet known are not absences. They are futures. They are reasons to return. And the people who sense, even if they cannot name it, that there is more of you to understand, more layers that have not yet been offered, will keep returning with an urgency they experience as personal, as authentic desire, when in fact it is something more structural. It is the mind obeying its own compulsion toward resolution. The fourth and final adjustment in this part involves the management of leverage, specifically the leverage created by your own scarcity of emotional response. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive shift, because it requires you to do less rather than more. Every time you react noticeably to what someone does, every time you visibly respond to their attention, their approval, their criticism, their absence, you are giving them information about how much they matter to your internal state, and that information is leverage, not leverage you hold, leverage they hold over you, because now they know what moves you, they know the buttons. They may not use that knowledge maliciously, but they will use it, everyone does, to calibrate how they engage with you, what they can expect from you, and ultimately how much they need to invest in maintaining your interest versus simply adjusting their behavior to keep your emotional response within a manageable range. When you reduce your visible reactivity, when your internal response to someone's behavior does not automatically transmit itself to the surface, something interesting happens. The other person loses certainty, not catastrophically, but just enough. They can no longer fully read the landscape of your interior. They cannot predict with confidence how you are responding to them. And this mild, non-hostile uncertainty is extraordinarily productive for sustained engagement, because the mind, in the presence of uncertain feedback, does not become less invested. It becomes more invested. It increases its attention, increases its effort, increases the amount of cognitive and emotional resource it is willing to deploy in order to close the gap between what it can see and what it suspects might be there. Everything in the previous three parts has been preparation, necessary preparation, foundational, functional, real, but preparation nonetheless, because behavior modification, however precise, is still reactive. It is still the work of adjusting how you respond to a world that you did not design. What you are moving toward now is something qualitatively different. You are moving from tactics to architecture, from adjustment to positioning, from managing individual interactions to constructing the structural conditions under which influence becomes self-sustaining. This is the difference between someone who has learned to play the game well and someone who has understood the game well enough to change the board. The shift is subtle from the outside. From the inside, it is total. The first dimension of strategic architecture is the deliberate construction of what might be called your psychological signature. Every person who commands sustained influence, whether in intimate relationships, professional environments, or broader social fields, has one. A psychological signature is not a personal brand. Personal branding is external. A psychological signature is internal. It is the distinctive quality of your presence, the specific way that being in proximity to you feels, the particular register your mind operates in, the characteristic way you hold and release attention. Most people's psychological signature is accidental. It is whatever combination of formative experiences, adaptive strategies, and unconscious habits has accreted over time into something loosely identifiable as a personality. It was not chosen. It was inherited from circumstances that no longer exist, and it is operating in contexts it was never designed for. Building a deliberate psychological signature requires an honest inventory of what you actually are, not what you would like to be, not what you perform in social situations, not the version of yourself you present on your best days, but the coherent core that is actually present across all conditions. This inventory is uncomfortable. It reveals places where you are inconsistent, where you capitulate to social pressure, where you perform a version of yourself that costs energy to maintain. But it also reveals genuine strengths, qualities of mind or character that you may have undervalued because they do not announce themselves loudly enough to get the social credit that louder performances receive. The work of building a psychological signature involves stripping away what is performed and fortifying what is actual, not improving the performance, deepening the reality. When your signature is genuine, when the quality of your presence is an accurate expression of a coherent interior, it has a weight to it that performance never achieves. People feel the difference between someone who is being themselves and someone who is doing a very good impression of themselves. They may not be able to articulate the difference, but their nervous systems register it as signal versus noise, and only signal earns the sustained cognitive investment that produces real influence. Your signature, once built and genuinely inhabited, works for you constantly in every room without requiring your active maintenance. It precedes you into interactions and persists after you leave them. It is the part of you that other people carry with them without realizing they are carrying it. The second dimension of power architecture is the strategic management of your social presence, specifically the calibration of visibility and withdrawal. Most people operate in one of two modes. They are either fully present, maximally available, doing everything they can to maintain connection and engagement, or they withdraw entirely, either because they are depleted or because a relationship has become painful. Neither of these is a position of architectural strength. Full presence maintained continuously collapses into the availability problem described in Part 2. Complete withdrawal collapses into absence, and absence, without the right preceding conditions, is simply irrelevance. What generates and maintains psychological investment is neither constant presence nor unpredictable absence. It is rhythmic contrast. Rhythmic contrast is the deliberate alternation between deep engagement and quiet withdrawal, not to punish or manipulate, but to create the experiential conditions under which the value of your presence is felt most acutely. When you are present, you are genuinely fully present, attentive, engaged, bringing the full quality of your intelligence and warmth to the interaction. And then you step back, naturally, without drama, without explanation, without the kind of performed withdrawal that announces itself and invites the very pursuit it is pretending to discourage. You simply redirect your attention to your own life, to your work, your development, your interior world, and in doing so, you create a space in the other person's experience where your presence used to be. That space is not comfortable, it is not supposed to be, but it is generative. It generates longing, which is a form of focused, sustained psychological attention. And sustained psychological attention directed at you is the most precise definition of obsession that actually applies to adult human experience. The third dimension is the architecture of your decision-making, specifically the visible quality of how you decide things. Nothing communicates psychological position more clearly than how someone handles choice under social pressure. Most people's decision-making is, in a significant way, outsourced. They calibrate their choices to social feedback. They adjust their positions when they sense disapproval. They hedge their commitments in proportion to the perceived risk of social cost. This is understandable. Social approval is a genuine human need, and the fear of social exclusion is a deeply wired survival response. But it creates a visible pattern, a traceable quality in your behavior that communicates below the level of conscious articulation that your center of gravity is external, that you are being moved by the field rather than moving through it. And this quality, once someone has sensed it, is impossible to unsense. It changes how they experience you. It makes you, regardless of any other qualities you possess, psychologically predictable. And predictable, as you now know completely, is the end of fascination. Decisive, self-authored action, even in small things, even in low-stakes contexts, accumulates into a posture that is unmistakable. It is the posture of someone whose choices originate from an interior standard rather than an exterior consensus. This does not mean rigidity. It does not mean refusing to consider other perspectives or refusing to change your mind when genuine new information warrants it. It means that the locus of evaluation is inside you, that you can receive input, process it honestly, and then decide from your own values and your own reading of the situation, without the decision being visibly driven by the desire to manage someone else's emotional response to you. People who operate this way do not experience significantly fewer social frictions than people who calibrate constantly to approval. But they experience a different quality of friction, one that, paradoxically, generates more respect than the frictionless accommodation they replaced. The fourth dimension is the most powerful and, in some ways, the most quietly radical. It is the architecture of self-referentiality, the quality of being most fundamentally oriented toward your own development, your own standards, your own sense of what constitutes a life worth living. This is not selfishness. Selfishness is the indulgence of immediate desire at the cost of others. Self-referentiality is simply the positioning of your own interior authority as the primary evaluative center of your life. It means that the primary question you are answering in how you move through the world is not, what will this communicate to others about me, but is this consistent with who I am choosing to become? This is a completely different orientation than almost anything contemporary culture teaches, because contemporary culture is almost entirely externally oriented in its prescriptions for how to live, how to be attractive, how to succeed, how to matter. And because external orientation is so culturally normative, its absence is experienced by other people as extraordinary, as a quality of self-possession that they have rarely encountered and cannot immediately categorize. This is the deepest source of the magnetic quality you have been working toward. Not the tempo of your responses, not the sequencing of your revelations, not the management of your emotional visibility. Those are all genuine and necessary adjustments, but they are downstream of this. They derive their effectiveness from the genuine internal reality they are meant to express. When someone encounters a person who is genuinely, structurally, non-performatively self-referential, whose attention, whose approval, whose presence feels as though it is being given from genuine surplus rather than anxious management, something activates in them that cannot be deactivated by logic or willpower. Because they are not experiencing a technique, they are experiencing a quality of being that they recognize below conscious thought as rare, as real, as worth pursuing, as something that, if they can sustain proximity to it long enough, might teach them something about what they themselves are still becoming. The final architecture you need to understand, and to embody rather than merely understand, is the architecture of long-term positioning over short-term impression. The entire framework you have been receiving in these 4 parts is not designed to help you win a single interaction. It is designed to help you restructure your overall position in the social and relational fields you inhabit. Short-term impression management is exhausting, temporary, and ultimately self-defeating. It requires constant recalibration, constant performance, constant attention to how you are being perceived. Long-term positioning, by contrast, is generative. Once the structural conditions are in place, once your psychological signature is genuine, your visibility is rhythmically calibrated, your decision-making is self-authored, and your orientation is fundamentally internal. The system runs with decreasing amounts of conscious maintenance, because what you have built is not a strategy, it is a self. And a genuine, coherent, deeply inhabited self does not need to manage its influence, because influence is simply what such a self naturally produces. This is the quiet authority that was promised at the beginning, not loud dominance, which requires constant assertion and constant defense, but the kind of authority that arrives before you speak and remains after you leave, the kind that other people feel in your presence and seek in your absence, the kind that generates not just attention or attraction, but the specific, involuntary, sustained return of someone's mind to you again and again, without their permission, without your effort, which is the only definition of obsession that was ever worth building toward. Not because you need it, because you have become, through the accumulation of all of this, something worth returning to.